I hope that the Labor Party will direct far more public sector funding into the university sector. You can't dodge that if we are to lessen the pressures on university staff, if we are to lessen the pressures on students, then we need to do something quite radical with increasing funding to the universities. And you know as well as I do that over the last decade, beginning with 1996 when the Howard government slashed 1.9 billion or thereabouts from the university sector, that it's been downhill in terms of university funding. And the recent OECD report, notwithstanding what the coalition government did in the recent budget, the recent OECD reports states very clearly that Australia is way down the bottom end of its commitment to funding for the public sector universities. Labor has made it very clear in its education revolution, which is hopefully something more than rhetoric. It is a multi-tiered attack on education in Australia from preschool through to universities. I hope that is absolutely matched with a commitment by Labor to fund that exercise, because without that we won't be able to lessen the pressures on students, to lessen the pressures on staff.
Welcome back to YouDecide 2007. That video was taken last week at a seminar out at the University of Queensland. All the political candidates from Ryan, which I think we all agree now has got to be regarded as a marginal seat, were invited. You just saw Ross Daniels, who's the Labor candidate. You didn't see the Liberal candidate because the Liberal candidate didn't show. So we might sound like we're picking on Mr Daniels in a couple of minutes, but that's because he was the only major party representative there. Now, the thing that I found interesting about that was that he really seemed to be shaving Labor policy a bit, didn't he? He seemed to be giving his audience the impression that they wouldn't pay HECS under Labor, there'd be plenty of time for extracurricular activity at universities, and there'd probably be more funding in the system. Now, is that legitimate behaviour for a candidate? Is that within the ambit of what's acceptable?
I don't think he listened to the same video that I did. I didn't hear those things. I heard what were desirable goals for university, and I think that's very good behaviour for a candidate.
But I think Graham's also referring to, I mean, he certainly mentioned that he was hoping that the Labor policy would be, the education revolution that Rudd talks about would be more than just rhetoric. And I mean, I would agree with you that his goals were very admirable.
He was almost oppositional to his own party, wasn't he?
Well,
and maybe he had to be because Michael Johnson wasn't there. But
well, yeah, I mean, I didn't find it difficult, and I think that they were motherhood statements. But that's pretty good for education. We've had so much punitive behaviour towards education for 11 years that I quite like a few
so
motherhood
it's legitimate
statements.
for a candidate who, if he gets elected, will be regarded as a once and will have no power in the caucus whatsoever to tell anyone whatever he thinks they want to hear to get elected. Is that
this particular candidate is actually not a trade union official. He's actually a higher education insider, and he probably has a very, very well developed understanding of what's actually happening in higher education. And I must confess, I think that's rare in the Parliament. I mean, there's been this great divide between the Vice-Chancellors and the government. There's really been a lack of engagement up until the fairly recent past.
But he had a wish list, didn't he?
He did have a wish list.
And he's someone who knows the business, and
yes,
so he had a wish list.
Yes.
And, maybe it becomes Labor policy. But I didn't find that distressing. I mean, I'd much rather talk about what the policies are.
Okay, well, why don't we talk about what the policies are? I think that's probably a good thing to do.
If he's talking about increased funding for the higher education sector, the critical question has got to be, where does it come from? My reading of the education revolution policy is that it's actually going to target early childhood first. It sees a step process, and it actually sees higher education as being at the top of the scale, the end of the process. So I think that we're going to see a lot more money spent in early childhood education under an incoming government, Labor government, not in higher education.
Well, if you have a look at their policies, the first one starts with funding preschool years, and it goes on to investing money into high school to create trade training centres. Then it goes on to providing the 50% education tax refund, and then the individual learning plans, and then the last thing is that offering incentives to students who study maths and science. I mean, it talks about halving HECS debt to study those subjects and then halving it again to practice.
So
which is
this is the education revolution. How does it differ from the Liberal Party or the other parties? policies?
Well, at least they're putting some extra money into it. I mean, that's what I'm concerned about.
Well, are they?
Well, I think so. I mean, it's...
Are they, or are they just redirecting money? I mean, every government and opposition's now working under fairly strict budget deadlines, aren't they? So,
what's the size of the surplus again?
Yeah, 17 billion, I think.
that was before the $23 billion tax cut.
I think it's more.
And I must confess, in terms of macroeconomic policy, I'm actually perplexed as to why an organisation that's allegedly as smart as the National Treasury cannot give us a very good forecast on the
That's probably why we need more maths and science graduates.
But
it could be right.
There's absolutely no argument that higher education has gone backwards under the Howard government, that it's in a tragic situation, and please, 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 can't we do something about it? I mean, I think...
My generation feels that.
The critical factor, and this is the politics of it, the critical factor in higher education policy reform is the friendship between the Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University and the incoming Prime Minister, because they both work together in George Street, in the Goss government, and that's the link.
There's
that's going
3
to make
weeks
the
to
difference.
go, and let's look forward to it. But I often think that Mr. Howard must have had a very miserable time at university, because he spent almost his entire time as Prime Minister punishing universities.
What's your definition of punishing universities?
Oh, the extent to which they've had, I looked at some of the announcements made by Brendan Nelson, and there wasn't a single policy announcement that wasn't accompanied by, and if you don't, I'll take your money. That sort of punishment.
The sort of interference by Brendan Nelson in the ARC grants is totally unconscionable. I mean, it's bordering on a criminal offence, in my view.
To stop them doing... he vetoed research.
Hang on, what were they... Can you just explain?
Yes, Brendan Nelson personally interfered in the disbursement of Australian Research Council grants, which are awarded on the basis of peer review.
And we should say this program gets an ARC grant.
Yes, it's a very rigorous process.
He must like you.
And Nelson...
I didn't sign the bottom of it.
Nelson interfered with it. And I think that's unconscionable.
He vetoed a research project that was examining the media treatment of the children overboard after it had been approved by the ARC and all the peer review, etc., and he vetoed it.
So, just to wind up, what Ross Daniels did there, that's fair reflection of Labor Party policy? Something that you should vote on?
It's aspirational, to use a John Howard word.
Aspirational, Caroline?
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
You agree?
Very aspirational and very admirable.
Okay.